Russian dictator Vladimir Putin recently visited command center of the Russian army in the Kursk region.
Yes.
He was wearing a military uniform.
Yes.
Do you see this as a kind of message to the West that he does not want to stop this war? He would like to move forward, to continue?
I'm not sure that picture was for an international audience. His uniform was very clean. It was not faded. Most military uniforms, the darker green becomes lighter and lighter when you wash it lots of times. His was very new, very clean. He looked an old man in that military uniform. It did not look like the uniform of a fighting man. He looked, how old is he? 74 years old now? He looked that old in those pictures. And it's the first time he's visited Kursk ever since Ukraine moved in there. I think that was much more for a domestic audience, for his Russian audience that says, who've been saying, why had you allowed Russia to be invaded? Why had you not protected Russia? And because Putin did not know when he would be able to seize the territory back, he did not visit. I think he's very confident now that his military are about to push Ukraine out. So now he wants to associate himself in military uniform with a great Russian victory. And I think that's for his domestic audience. I don't think anybody in the West is taking any notice at all of what he wears. However this war finishes, President Putin will want to demonstrate to the Russian people that this has been a great victory for Russia, that it's been worth the sacrifice, it's been worth the cost, it's been worth the inflation, the effect on the economy. And I think he is preparing the ground for being able to demonstrate that he was the great Russian leader, he was the great Russian wartime leader that delivered this great victory to his nation. I think that's what that picture was all about.
Don't you think that it was a little bit funny because he is not a military man wearing a military uniform, he didn't fight wars? What is your take on that?
He's not the only Russian leader who has not fought in the military but wears military uniform. And that's why I don't think that was for an international audience. I think that was much more for a domestic Russian audience. One thing that we in the West struggle with is understanding just how much Russia controls the media. I'm here from United Kingdom, I'm here in Ukraine in this fabulous hangar with lots of old aircraft in it, and as a former pilot I love being in this environment, but we tend to forget that a lot of what Vladimir Putin is doing, he controls all of the media. I'm here to help you and to help Ukraine, but Vladimir Putin controls everything in Russia. They hear what he wants to tell them. He tells them that they're on the front foot. He doesn't tell them about the casualties. He doesn't tell them that Russia started this war. He tells them all a very different story. And I think that's where we have to watch some of his actions and how he dresses, because that's very much for his domestic audience.
Also, you mentioned that he was looking quite old. Do you believe that it was really Vladimir Putin?
I know there are a lot of people who suggest that there may be doppelgangers, 2 or 3 or 4 Vladimir Putins. I don't like getting involved. I'm a military man. Does it make any difference to the strategy? No, it doesn't. I think if you were a soldier on the ground and you had met Vladimir Putin before, and then another Vladimir Putin arrived, you'd know it was not the real one. And that, I think, would be very difficult because the rumors would spread quickly. I do recognize that Vladimir Putin needs to protect himself. He knows that he may well be an unpopular leader within the military, because the military are the people who have lost a lot of lives. The way that the Russian forces fight on the front line means that they accept massive casualties, but it does deliver advancement on the battlefield. a lot of soldiers will have lost a lot of friends, a lot of colleagues. So I suspect Vladimir Putin would want to be very careful if he visited the front line with soldiers, with guns, with bullets. He would not want to give anybody the chance to wreak revenge against him.
From your perspective, I have discussed this issue with many former military leaders, experts. From your perspective, does Vladimir Putin regret invading Ukraine?
I think that's a really good question. I look back at February 22, when Russian forces massed near the Ukrainian border and then made a push against Kyiv, and that 40-mile convoy and reports that many of the Russian soldiers had their dress uniform with them because they expected to be welcomed into Kyiv and with flowers. And thank you for...
It was failure in intelligence.
Well, a massive failure of intelligence. And that would have been very humiliating for President Putin. He always called it that special military operation. And what we saw is the war has moved backwards and forwards. But what is clear now is that President Putin is securing that land bridge of the 4 regions of the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, linking to Crimea. And that gives much more security for the vital port of Sevastopol for Russia. I think if you look back, I think Russia would not have expected 3 years on to still be fighting. But I think Vladimir Putin sees his place in history. In his offices, there are big statues of Peter the Great and some heroes of the former Soviet Union. I think he sees his place in history as retaking some of those nations that were once the Soviet Union. And so whilst he probably didn't expect it to be this difficult, if you look at it through a different lens, he might have been very scared of NATO. I think he's less scared of NATO now because he's managed to scare Western politicians to not get involved. I think he's formed new relationships with Iran, with North Korea, with China. So in some respects, I think he might believe he is making Russia great again. And I know that sounds strange from where we sit in Ukraine, but this is all about his own audience, his own history, as he writes history, his chapter of it. So yes, I think he will be surprised it took so long, but I think strategically he will be very pleased with what has happened so far.
I would like also to cover with you possible scenarios in case of a ceasefire deal. If Russia accepts a ceasefire deal in the nearest future, can Russia violate this deal and try to decapitate Ukrainian government by making, for example, great push to capture Kyiv or Sumy?
I think the question here is, it's one thing having a ceasefire, it's quite another how you provide the security environment to stop Russia doing this again. I think many in the West, I think particularly President Trump, just sees this as an opportunity to stop the fighting, stop the killing. As a military guy, unless you solve the problem, you don't end the war. The battle may stop, but you don't end the war. And last time I came to Ukraine in October, I was reminded several times that this war didn't start in 2022. It didn't start in 2014. Russia in various forms has been attacking Ukraine for 300 years and trying to destroy its people, its language, its culture, its civilization. And that Russia won't stop. So pausing the war with a ceasefire will never be the answer. The answer has to be a robust security environment in that post-war time. And that, I think, is the most difficult conversation. I think President Zelensky has recognized he needs American help and therefore agreed to negotiate, but he's been very clear, I cannot allow my country to agree a peace unless we have something very robust in terms of security environment. And I was reminded when I came here last time, I remember history, 1994, the Budapest Memo, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power, and Ukraine agreed to give back its nuclear weapons in return for a cast iron guarantee about the sovereignty of the country. 20 years later, Putin moves in and the West largely does nothing about it. That memory will not allow President Zelensky to accept a signature on a bit of paper. It has to be something more robust. And I think that is something that America, the West, Europe, my country is trying to work out. How do you provide that security environment? And of course, President Putin is going to say no, because he will want to maintain the option of having another bite at Ukraine in the future.
My first question would be about this security guarantees for Ukraine. How would you like to see this robust security guarantees for Ukraine, and can the United Kingdom, France and other European allies provide Ukraine with enough security without American commitment, without US backstop?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. And one of the reasons I think it is so difficult is if you look at it in detail. Let's take one example. One military assessment said that we would need to have a force of 100,000 soldiers in Ukraine to provide that security guarantee. My country, we have 74,000 soldiers in the British Army, so it feels like we're almost there. But if you look at how many of our soldiers can be deployed, because some of them are doing training, some of them are in logistics, some of them, it's about 35,000 that can be deployed.
Only British troops.
I'm just talking about British troops now. And if you wanted to have an enduring presence in Ukraine, let's supposing they were there for 4 months at a time, you'd have to have one team deployed, another team preparing to deploy, and the team that's just come back having some holiday and a break. So you need to have 3 units, 3 times the number of forces that are actually deployed there. If you have 30,000 available, that means you can only support 10,000 on the ground at any one time. So if the United Kingdom can only do 10,000, let's supposing France and Germany can do a similar number, that still isn't half of the forces that are needed. So where do the rest of the forces come from? Poland is spending a lot more money on defence now, but if I was Polish, I'd be more worried about defending my country than putting forces into Ukraine. And there are some countries like Italy which are still not taking this very seriously at all. So practically, it's very difficult. I think the one thing that and we heard our British Prime Minister talking to this, is we didn't want to get involved with a no-fly zone at the start of the war, but I do think a no-fly zone would be a very effective way of stopping Russia advancing. Western technology in air is far better than Russia, and Russia has shown how it operates for the last 3 years. The West has been sucking all that information up. It now understands much better how all of these weapons, Kinzhal, some of the high-end weapons. So I think that would be a very effective way of contributing to some form of post-war security environment. But it's not easy.
Yes, we are hearing an air alert. It could be a sign that Vladimir Putin is not really happy about a ceasefire proposal from US President Donald Trump. It even could be a sign that Vladimir Putin tried to humiliate Donald Trump because he continued to attack Ukraine after this big best offer from US President Donald Trump.
Yes, I think there's a danger sometimes that we react to everything that happens each day. There is a war going on, and Vladimir Putin and his forces will be looking to do everything possible to achieve their objectives. They're not stopping. We haven't agreed a ceasefire. They will keep pushing hard. And I suspect we would do exactly the same if roles were reversed. I don't think Vladimir Putin would want to humiliate President Trump. He would not want to make an enemy of the biggest superpower in the world. I believe a number of military analysts who think that the West has done enough to stop Ukraine losing, but has not done enough to help it win. And military forces in the West are far more powerful than Russia. If we were to get involved, Russia would be stopped straight away. And if Putin was to make an enemy of President Trump, and Trump suddenly decided to say, right, we're going to get involved, that would not be something that Russia would want. Putin has, every step of the way, has tried to scare the West not to get involved. So I'd be very surprised if Putin wants to insult President Trump. President Trump offers him a way out. It offers President Putin an off-ramp, a way to end the war. I'd be very surprised if he wants to humiliate him.
RichardNewton is a retired US Air Force Lieutenant General. Welcome to our program, General Newton.
Daniel, good to be back with you.
Ukraine has agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. US proposal on a ceasefire on the ground, in the air and at sea. Meanwhile, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin also has reacted to this proposal. He says that he agrees with this initiative, but he is also imposing his own terms. What is your reaction? How can you assess the reaction of Vladimir Putin to this initiative of a ceasefire plan from Ukraine and the United States?
Well, first off, it's been quite a tumultuous period of diplomacy over the last several days since February 28th of that time in the Oval Office with President Zelensky and President Trump. But here we are now, now that President Zelensky and President Trump have both agreed to significant terms for a 30-day ceasefire that will set up, hopefully, peace negotiations thereafter. I think what President Zelensky has agreed to is significant. I think it's one that is great resolve on his part, and frankly, great resolve on President Trump's part. Now the ball is in Putin and Russia's court. However, I do not anticipate at all Putin or Russia cooperating through ceasefire negotiations or permanent, peace agreement negotiations, but at least we've got now an opportunity for further discussions. And I think you're going to see from Putin, he will be very difficult and somewhat of an untrustworthy adversary in these negotiations. But at least I think we're on the cusp, Daniel, of beginning some discussions.
Do you expect Vladimir Putin to finally agree with this ceasefire proposal in the nearest future if enough pressure is being put on Russia and Kremlin?
I would not anticipate it anytime soon because I see Russia on the offense, especially trying to dislodge Ukrainian forces who unprecedentedly took the Kursk region, the first time that Russia actually has been invaded and territory taken away from Russia back in August of 2024. That was a brilliant move on President Zelensky and Ukrainians' part. But nonetheless, Putin is on the offensive trying to dislodge Ukrainian forces as well as trying to gain as much positions they possibly can on that 600-mile front in the eastern part of Ukraine before he enters into an agreement to actually have a 30-day ceasefire. I would also remind our viewers, and you know this is better than I do, that since that negotiation or agreement for a ceasefire negotiation framework between President Trump and President Zelensky, that Russia has attacked Ukraine, Kyiv, and other cities 250 plus drone attacks as well as several ballistic missile attacks. So I think you're going to see Putin on the offensive here as long as he can in order to try to put him into the best position for those at least those 30-day ceasefire negotiations.
Do you see these air attacks on Ukraine after the beginning of negotiations between Ukraine, the United States and Russia as an intimidation, as an insult from Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump?
I think, let me back up. I don't think Putin has stopped intimidating Ukraine or the West since he invaded back on February 24th of 2022. And fast forward to today, he will. He'll take every tool out of his war chest, but also diplomatically to try to intimidate President Trump and perhaps a unified front now between not only the United States and Ukraine, but also Europe. But Trump is going to stand his ground. He's going to make it a very tough, he'll maintain very tough positions in negotiating with Putin. They sound nice, if you will, across the ocean in terms of their pronouncements of the last couple days. But I think you're going to find President Trump maintaining a very tough stance from a military standpoint, sure, because he's now again providing Ukraine with minute-by-minute intelligence. But also has now continued with U.S. providing military support. We still have over $3 billion, Daniel, of military capabilities in the pipeline that we could provide Ukraine. I would also offer up that President Trump did away with the exemptions for Europe, European Union as well as European nations that allowed them to have oil and gas sales between themselves and Russia. They're no longer permitted to do that. My point being is, I think the biggest card that Trump has to play is the economic card, where now European Union and those European nations can no longer, from a sanction standpoint or an exemption to those sanctions, be able to do oil and gas deals with Putin and Russia. That will hurt Putin financially, and Trump knows that.
So you're confident that Vladimir Putin will try to gain as much as possible, as much Ukrainian land as possible before he enters negotiations seriously?
I absolutely agree with that. And again, it goes back, and you and I talked about this last time. We cannot trust Putin. And therefore, the only thing Putin will understand as the attacker of Ukraine, but also the bully that we know him to be, is the only thing he understands is strength. And the only thing he understands is a united front between the United States, Ukraine, and the rest of Europe. That's what's really been remarkable since that tumultuous meeting in the Oval Office on February 28th to where we are right now. I see a much more unified position between the United States and Ukraine, as well as with Europe. Putin will understand that. But I think the thing that's really going to impact him and deter him or get him to the negotiating table, at least it'd be in the ceasefire negotiations at the beginning, are really the economic and financial challenges that his country is going to face in the coming months and perhaps even over a year or two, faced with a strong U.S. position financially and economically vis-a-vis sanctioning Putin and Russia, especially with his oil and gas sales.
From your perspective, do you see this recent reaction, TV address from Vladimir Putin to Trump reacting to this proposal as a no to this proposal, or do you see this as a rejection of Trump's proposal?
I see it as perhaps more on the rejection side. However, it's more to be determined. I think what Putin is trying to do is he's just trying to stall for a better position on the battlefield. Earlier this week, Daniel, we didn't see a Putin in a business suit, but we saw him in military fatigues. We saw him, that is sending a message to the rest of the world. He also, for the first time, visited the front lines, Russia's front lines in the Kursk region, and met with his theater commander. So he's trying to also own the optics of how he is to be viewed, not only internally in Russia, but externally. And so even something as maybe seen as simple as him being in military fatigues, I think would warrant us to consider him to be even a more hardened position, certainly at the outset as he enters into or contemplates his next steps in these 30-day ceasefire negotiations.
You just mentioned about Vladimir Putin wearing a military uniform. Do you see this as a message that he will continue this war despite all the odds?
I think, given every opportunity, he will try to continue the war as long as it suits his best interests. However, again, you know this better than I do. There have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers and certainly innocent Ukrainian civilians, but soldiers on both sides who've been killed in action and wounded. And of course, the atrocities that have been levied against, Ukrainian civilians, innocent Ukrainian citizens. These are war criminal acts. And so Putin putting on this military uniform does not give him any credibility at all. He's a war criminal, but I do believe that he will strive to put the Russian military in the best possible position up until at the point where he will, I think, eventually agree to ceasefire negotiations and a ceasefire itself. But he's trying to keep Russian military on the offense as Ukraine digs in on the defense.
So you're confident that Vladimir Putin has no other choice but to agree with ceasefire proposal today or in the nearest future?
I think eventually he will, but it's going to take a continued strong position between President Trump and President Zelensky, as well as with European allies. President Trump met with the NATO Security General yesterday in the Oval Office, and they had a very clear message to not only our European allies, but to Putin, that there is very little daylight between the United States and NATO. That's significant. We need to keep that going. We need to keep that thought moving forward because, Daniel, once ceasefire negotiations or long-term, they're what I would call a phase 2, long-term peace negotiations, they're going to get bumpy. Diplomacy is messy. There's nothing linear about it. And it's less about the process, but more about the results. And so I think that you're going to need to see a play for U.S. providing long-term commitment to, yes, military capabilities, intelligence support, but also economic sanctions against Russia that the United States is leading. And I think right now President Trump is leading very effectively. But that will need to continue through the weeks and the months and even into the next year or two to give those long-term security guarantees for President Zelensky and for Ukraine so that Russia never ever is able or would even contemplate invading Ukraine or any other Western country again.
From your perspective, for how long could this process of negotiations be in the place, be active? For how long, how much would take it to negotiate a ceasefire? How many months or even years?
I think for the immediate 30-day ceasefire, that is, I'm sure, several weeks into months. And then what I would call phase 2 into the long-term peace agreement, that's into months, perhaps early into 2026. The diplomacy behind this, it's not easy. As I mentioned earlier, diplomacy is messy. I've negotiated with the Russians. They can be hard. They can be, in my view, untrustworthy. They will lie and steal and cheat as much as they possibly can. But what will hold their feet to the fire is making sure that they see that there's no more gain for them, essentially from Putin's standpoint, militarily on the battlefield, but also economically and financially. I believe that is the significant card that the United States and a unified Ukraine holds, as those economic and financial cards that we have against Putin, because his economy is not in a very good position. You'll at some point, perhaps you'll see some discontent with the Russian people if they're starting to feel those economic, financial challenges that they felt, by the way, through decades, but even more so because of how much Putin has obligated to blood and treasure to this heinous attack, not only in 2022, but certainly all the way back to 2014.
Do you expect the U.S. to continue providing Ukraine with security assistance after the end or after the beginning of ceasefire?
I do, and I would advise President Trump not necessarily to keep what we call an open checkbook and so forth, but provide the necessary intelligence capabilities, intelligence sources, and to some degree military capabilities that Europe and the NATO forces can't provide. The United States provides exquisite, what we call enablers, that is very capable air defense for Ukraine, not necessarily to be offensive over the next several years, but defensive in order to protect its innocent men and women, as well as the fact that obviously a sovereign nation. And also I would remind our viewers, there is another security guarantee that I understand has been now worked out between the United States and Ukraine is the mineral deal. That can provide up to $500 billion of economic financial opportunity for the United States as well as for Ukraine. Sometimes there's nothing better than a very solid economic, financial, strong relationship between our two nations. I think will also lend itself for a security guarantee beyond military, but certain economically as well.
How do you see U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine? Because it seems like Trump's administration is unwilling to provide a backstop for British and French troops conducting this peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. How do you see the security guarantees?
I wouldn't necessarily use the term, perhaps unwilling may not be the right term, but what President Trump has done over the last couple of weeks is really compelled Europe, in this case the United Kingdom, France, and others, to provide actual boots on the ground as peacekeeping troops. In fact, the United Kingdom has offered up to 30,000 troops for peacekeeping forces on the ground for not only the ceasefire but for the long-term peace agreement. That's a good thing, by the way. It shouldn't be just the United States going alone, but the United States leading in this case. I believe you'll find President Trump is still going to be willing to support NATO and lead NATO, but it's a different era right now, and that is compelling Europe to provide more than just, for instance, 2% of their gross domestic product, but perhaps up to 5% of their gross domestic product of building up their militaries. They no longer have a luxury, if you will, of the United States providing the overarching capabilities, which was what I would call an open checkbook. But nonetheless, President Trump's not walking away from NATO. He's not going to walk away from Europe. He's certainly not going to walk away from Ukraine. And I go back to that mineral agreement that he has now brought to bear and agreed with President Zelensky. Putin will see that. He'll see that as what he thought was a glaring gap back on February 28th after the Oval Office discussions. He'll see now a closing of that gap significantly with U.S. leadership as well as with President Zelensky as well as the Europeans with that security agreement, that mineral security agreement, closing that gap in our relationship economically and financially. He'll also see the fact that you've got a stronger Europe that has been, that President Trump has compelled Europe to move forward with in terms of them providing their military capabilities and even boots on the ground to guard those borders, as well as in the event that it's negotiated to actually put European forces as peacekeeping forces to prevent Putin from breaking any type of agreement arrangement.